name is Nary Santos. I'm the VP for the EMS here in Canada. And our theme this year is Mission Amid Global Crisis. I'd like to refer you to your event materials. There are 3 sets that you can be navigating through smoothly. First is our schedule for the whole day. It includes all the rooms, the times, and the events related to today. The second is the plenary presentation, abstracts, and the brief bio. So we have 3 plenary sessions, one representing the agency, the next the assembly, and the third the academy. And the third set, which is the most lengthy, is the paper presentation, abstracts, and the brief bio of the paper presenters. So for this segment, we will be starting our plenary session on the mission of God and the people and the role of humanitarian agencies in responding to the global crisis. And we requested somebody who represented the agency. Dr. Ruben Das is the National Director of the Canadian Bible Society, and he is a research professor here at Tyndale. And you can look at his abstract or his bio fully in the second set of materials. But for now, let's welcome Dr. Ruben Das.
Thanks, Neri. Neri's instructions to the presenters was as you have half an hour and that's it. And so I've timed it. It is half an hour, though it may seem like eternity. In the past few decades, the role of Christian humanitarian agencies has changed. And there isn't a proper understanding yet of how they fit into the mission of God. In a chaotic world, there is an increasing concern to respond to human need. Yet within significant sections of Western evangelical Christianity, there is still confusion as to how to prioritize this within Christian missions and how to integrate it with proclamation. Migration, displacement, and the resulting diaspora communities are not a new phenomenon. However, humanitarian emergencies resulting in forced displacement and migration are the new normal in the global community. Not only does displacement and migration originate in context of poverty and chaos, often rooted in conflict and economic and environmental catastrophes, but because of the sheer volume of refugees and migrants, the destination countries are struggling with existential issues of integration and identity, wondering how they relate to their long-held values of freedom of religion, cultural diversity, individual rights, and the concept of citizenship and who belongs. The United Nations 2018 report identified conflict as the main driver for humanitarian need over the long term, while natural disasters continue to affect people for short periods of time. The report stated that out of 135 million people requiring assistance was provided to only 97 million. In order to provide this aid, $25 billion was required. Whether a conflict or a natural disaster, the consequences are the same. People are displaced. In 2015, the United Nations reported that the number of people forcibly displaced had reached 65.3 million. This included refugees, those internally displaced, and the stateless. It is the highest global number since World War II. In addition, the number of migrants who are not forcibly displaced in 2015 had reached 244 million. Christian humanitarian agencies have been in the forefront of humanitarian responses. In the post-World War II years, according to a 1953 study, 90% of all post-war relief was provided by religiously affiliated agencies. However, in the decades that followed, the religious motivations for humanitarianism was replaced by a secular worldview, as religion came to be seen as a hindrance to progress. The suspicion is that local religious institutions, because of their communal and evangelistic nature, would not be able to adhere to the humanitarian principles of impartiality and unconditionality. As a result, there is a significant rise in secular non-governmental organizations. that were motivated by and operated on humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law. In order to be relevant and respected in a changing professional context and to be able to access bilateral and multilateral funding, most Christian humanitarian agencies separated the spiritual dimensions of ministry from temporal assistance. And as a result, there isn't much that differentiates them from the secular counterparts. The challenge for Christian humanitarian agencies is highlighted in the first 5 principles of the Red Cross Code of Conduct, which articulates the fundamental assumptions of humanitarian assistance being non-political and impartial in terms of religion, creed, race, and nationality. The emphasis is on aid being unconditional and based only on need. The only driver for assistance should be the humanitarian imperative. Yet this needs to be balanced with a respect for local culture and customs, which invariably includes religion, religious values, worldviews, and religious institutions in society. Aid should never be conditional on religious activity or involvement. However, the operations of Christian humanitarian agencies based on the Red Cross Code of Conduct raises some significant questions for the understanding of Christian missions. First, what is the relationship between evangelism and providing humanitarian aid? The 2001 Micah Declaration explained the relationship between the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. And I read, "Integral mission or holistic transformation is the proclamation and the demonstration of the gospel. It is not simply that evangelism and social involvement are to be done alongside each other. Rather, in integral mission, our proclamation has social consequences as we call people to love and repentance in all areas of life. And our social involvement has evangelistic consequences as we bear witness to the transforming grace of Jesus Christ." End of quote. The Micah Declaration finally provided the right balance between the verbal proclamation of the gospel and the demonstration of its reality. Neither operates independently, and each has significant implications for the other. While acknowledging that proclamation and acts of compassion are integrally linked, it did not clarify how both can be operationalized without perceptions of manipulation and conditionality. The second question that arises, is humanitarian assistance or other acts of compassion by themselves valid ministry and a part of the mission of God, even if there's no proclamation or evangelism? What are the biblical and theological foundations for these ministries? Connected with this, what is the difference between secular humanitarian agencies and the Christian counterparts who are involved in similar work and who do not do any sort of spiritual ministry? Third question, or set of questions. If disaster relief, community development, and other ministries of compassion are separated from other aspects of spiritual ministry, what are the objectives of these ministries? Is it socio-economic transformation, what Christian NGOs aim for? Is this socio-economic transformation a biblical concept? How different is it from the social gospel and its roots in liberal theology? And finally, what is the relationship between Christian humanitarian agencies and the local church? This has raised questions about ecclesiology and accountability. Now, these are not new questions, and each generation they assume a fresh sense of urgency. There is a need to answer these questions again as culture, the context, and the times change. In trying to understand the relevance and place of humanitarian agencies in the midst of the global crises and Christian mission, there are new lessons and insights emerging that are enabling evangelical missiologists to understand the mission of God, Missio Dei, at this time in history. To regain an effective place within the mission of God, what are some of the concepts that humanitarian agencies need to grapple with? And I will address 3. The first issue is the role of the local church as partners in mission and the global crisis. A few decades ago, most Christian NGOs walked away from partnering with local churches because they felt that they did not have the capacity to manage projects and had questions about manipulation and conditionality when churches do evangelism and recruit members in the midst of humanitarian crises or poverty alleviation projects. While acknowledging the necessity of legal and operational independence of Christian NGOs, there is now a new awareness of the critical role that local churches can play in humanitarian crises and in long-term community development. This is most evident when those who have been displaced, affected by disasters, or have been marginalized from society need a community to help their rehabilitation in the aftermath of a crisis or need integration into the mainstreams of society. Social scientists now acknowledge religious institutions such as churches, mosques, and temples are an integral part of a community. As social institutions in the community, they have obligations to that community. They not only address matters of spirituality, but also provide and build social capital, besides being venues through which social services are provided. Plamen Sivov, writing from the context of post-Soviet Bulgarian society, asks whether institutions such as churches can have a role as agents of community development, when previously the welfare state provided services and managed change. While acknowledging that the local church as an institutional service provider has no distinct advantage compared to other NGOs or the government, Sivov instead describes the local church as a distinct community. He writes, and I quote, "Whenever a communal spirit, high level of personal motivation, or personal approach to the sometimes dehumanized target group is needed, the church has a lot to offer. The church cannot compete on the grounds of quantity, but it has no match on the grounds of quality and holistic personalized approach when it comes to the provision of different kinds of care for the vulnerable groups." End of quote. It is this communal spirit and holistic approach to human beings, if churches are properly trained, could prove vital in addressing the needs of dehumanized and marginalized groups. This was evident in the response of local churches in Lebanon and in many countries of Europe to the Syrian refugee crisis. An indigenous Lebanese Christian NGO with international funding developed and implemented an extensive response to the needs of Syrian refugees in Lebanon and those internally displaced inside Syria, all through local churches. This provided a local identity to the humanitarian response rather than that of an international agency, and strengthened the credibility of the local church. It enabled a local faith community to demonstrate compassion. It empowered the local church to expand its own understanding of ministry, and finally, it ensured a long-term ministry to the refugees after the initial needs were met. It forged a new type of relationship between agencies and the local church. While the indigenous NGO provided the back office functions of program design, proposal writing, accessing funding, procurement of supplies, monitoring and reporting, the local church could be a church and do what churches do: show compassion, evangelize, teach, preach, disciple, equip, and pray, all without any conditionality or manipulation to the aid that they provided. Humanitarian agencies are able to do what local churches are often unable to do: provide technical assistance needed in specific humanitarian sectors, such as water, food aid and food security, shelter, nutrition, economic development, etc., and provide an awareness of the complexity of migration issues and international refugee law. Yet these agencies need local faith communities where those in need can feel safe and a sense of belonging. The local churches, because of their knowledge of the local community and volunteer base, are effective implementing partners for the agencies. There is now a greater understanding of how humanitarian agencies can partner with local churches, where each brings their strengths and expertise to work together to maximize impact. The second issue is the need for humanitarian agencies to understand the global dimensions of Missio Dei. Most Christian humanitarian agencies focus on responding to immediate needs and working towards long-term socioeconomic change, just as their secular counterparts do. They see this as ministry, since it demonstrates the love of Christ. Those involved in community development use terms like kingdom work and see themselves as building the kingdom of God. Their motivation is encapsulated in Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Beyond that, there is a limited understanding of eschatology, no awareness of historical theology and the struggles between the social gospel versus the fundamentalist, and little acknowledgement of the mission of God and what He is doing at this point in history. What they are missing is the understanding of the context in which they operate, namely God's purposes being worked out in the midst of man-made and natural disasters. They do not consider themselves as mission agencies, but identify themselves as Christian humanitarian agencies, and in some way believing that they're doing kingdom work. As mentioned earlier, displacement and migration, because of disasters and persecutions, are not a new phenomenon. The movement of people, forced and voluntary, resulting in diaspora communities, permeates biblical history, not as a background to the main narrative, but as fundamental to God's purposes. The present global refugee crisis and migration are being used by God, as He has throughout history, for the Great Commission and for the renewing of the church. Unlike historical missions where Western missionaries went out and ministered to the unreached in the fledgling church in the global south, today Christian immigrants and refugees from Asia, Africa, and Latin America are revitalizing the church in the West. Migration and displacement are presenting new opportunities for evangelism and proclamation among previously hard-to-reach people. Migrants and refugees, foreigners who are away from all that is familiar to them, lost and alone in their new country, seem to be much more open to God in their desperation than they are in their home countries. Missiological researcher Jenny McGill writes, "Migration blesses insofar as it enables people to experience God and thus experience a change of self-understanding. The nearness of God perhaps is no more acutely felt than during an experience of physical displacement." End of quote. Today, this is most evident in the openness of the gospel among the Iranian diaspora globally and Syrian and Afghan refugees in Lebanon and across Europe. Within the mission of God, there is a unique role for Christian humanitarian agencies to demonstrate the love and compassion of Christ to people devastated by conflicts and disasters or trapped in poverty, regardless of whether there is proclamation or not. However, the impact would be so much greater if they partnered with local churches and mission agencies to provide a more holistic response. By separating the humanitarian and compassionate dimensions of ministry from proclamation and other spiritual ministries, they are missing how God is using disasters and displacement to strengthen His church and draw hard-to-reach people to Himself. The third and final issue is that Western agencies and those who are suffering have different worldviews when faced with disaster, suffering, and marginalization. The historical struggle in modern Christian mission between the primacy of proclamation and a more holistic model, which also included ministries of compassion and social justice, is rooted in Plato's dualistic understanding of reality, which separates the physical, which is the material, from the spiritual, the immaterial. While the various Lausanne documents and the Micah Declaration have sought to integrate both dimensions, much of Christian mission still operates on this distinction. Many mission agencies focus on evangelism, church planting, and discipleship, and only provide material assistance when absolutely necessary, such as in a major disaster. On the other hand, most Christian humanitarian agencies operate independently of local churches and mission agencies, ensuring there is no proselytism during the humanitarian aid they provide or the community development work they do. Those mission agencies that do both proclamation and ministries of compassion usually separate these activities into different departments which operate independently. The majority of man-made and natural disasters today are in the global south, where people have different worldviews than Western Platonic dualism. Paul Hebert distinguishes between a modern scientific worldview with its primary focus on the material and the physical world, and a traditional religious worldview which is holistic, with the spiritual and the material worlds interwoven seamlessly. When people in the global south experience disasters and suffering, they are grateful for the help and aid that is provided. But because of their holistic worldview, they interpret their experience through a religious framework. Many times their traditional religious worldviews do not adequately answer the deeper existential questions about suffering and God, and they're looking for alternatives and answers. But because of their choice of separating compassion and aid from proclamation, most Christian humanitarian agencies are unable or unwilling to respond to these deep felt needs. Those Western agencies that try to respond usually bring an evangelist who preaches a standardized gospel message focusing on sin, forgiveness, and repentance. Recent research on conversion among poor in the global south shows that what attracts the majority of the poor is a God who is responsive, understands their suffering, and is with them, a God who identifies himself as Emmanuel. It is only later that they begin to understand the issues of sin and forgiveness. Their faith is based on a lived reality of the living God revealed in Jesus Christ, rather than on a robust intellectual Christianity based on a Platonic separation of the spiritual from the physical. For the non-Westerner, spiritual experience is followed by understanding, while for the Westerner, it is the reverse. So rather than presenting a God who's compassionate in the midst of their suffering, the evangelist starts with human failure and a God who is a judge and yet willing to forgive, a message that does not necessarily resonate with those who are suffering. The focus is on God who's Savior rather than Emmanuel. If, and this is a big question, if Western Christian humanitarian agencies choose to operate holistically, they actually face a twofold challenge. The first, an exclusive focus on the cognitive, the individual, and a logical systematization of theology in North American evangelical soteriology has resulted in what James Davison Hunter refers to as the methodization and standardization of spirituality within the evangelical tradition. He states that evangelicalism built on a propensity for what he says rationalization of spirituality in the 18th and 19th century Protestantism. Matthew Bate, in his book called Salvation by Allegiance Alone, he writes that this rationalization of spirituality is the result of the impact of the Enlightenment on not only the Christian faith, but also on mission. This rationalization does not consider the influence of context on a person's perceptions and understanding of spiritual issues or their needs. It is in the midst of these needs that in their desperation God meets them. This methodization and standardization of the gospel and spirituality limits how ministry can be done with people affected by disasters or trapped in poverty. There is a limited understanding of the gospel, and there is only one way it can be communicated. If humanitarian agencies choose to be holistic in their approach, they need to understand that Christian spirituality in much of the global south is very different than that of Western evangelicalism. They do not want to hear a standardized message, but want to encounter the living God and his love and concern in the midst of the struggles of daily life. The second challenge is understanding the context and the political frameworks that humanitarian and mission agencies operate from. These are very different than those of the people they minister to in the majority world. Western evangelical and Protestant Christianity is very Constantinian, based on a Christianized culture and access to power and an abundance of resources, rather than being based on models from the New Testament and the early church, where the church was often a persecuted minority. Christians in many parts of the majority world are a minority, where the dominant culture is not Christian or Christianized, and the government is often not sympathetic to Christians. The question they grapple with is, what does it mean to be followers of Christ and citizens of the kingdom in the midst of empire? Just as the early Christians struggled to follow Christ in the context of a brutal and unyielding Roman Empire. The two fundamental pillars of Western evangelical missions are reaching the world for Christ, evangelism and proclamation, and transforming communities and societies, social justice. The assumption is that there is freedom to choose who they worship and that they have a choice to determine what kind of society they want. In societies where Christians are minorities and in many cases marginalized, they do not have the luxuries of these options. The models from the very early church are instructive for marginalized and minority communities on how to address the issues of social justice and proclamation. Church historian Peter Brown refers to the Christians in the Roman Empire providing for the needs of the poor as a revolution that impacted the social imagination of the times. In the 4th and 5th centuries, as poverty increased in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, the cities were unable to absorb the poor who were not citizens. Brown writes that the existing structure of the cities and the civic model that had been associated with them collapsed under the sheer weight of a desolate human surplus. He then goes on to write, he said that the Christians who responded to the needs of the poor were themselves agents of change. This ministry of compassion and charity, as demonstrated by the lay people and the church leadership in the Roman Empire, had a significant impact on the social values of society. Walter Brueggemann highlights the growing appreciation and I quote, the legitimacy of the cry of the poor that created a social awareness that the powerful were obligated to provide justice and protection for the poor, end of quote. Church historian Alan Kreider writes about the very early church, writes about how the very early church grew in the midst of persecution and oppression. At times it was so severe that they had to meet in secret. Yet in the midst of that, Kreider writes, and I quote, and I love this quote, rumors that God was present in Christian gatherings may have also attracted outsiders to investigate Christianity, end of quote. What attracted pagans to Christianity was the reality of the living God revealed in Jesus Christ, even in the midst of, evident in the midst of Christian communities. There are significant differences in the theological frameworks from within which Western humanitarian agencies operate from and those of people affected by poverty and disaster. Western evangelicalism focuses on a triumphant God who has conquered sin and now enables his people to end poverty and reach the world for Christ. A triumphalist theology rings hollow for people who are confronted daily with the reality of evil and human sin and are oftentimes trapped by them. Instead, they intuitively understand the in-between times that we live in when the kingdom of God has come but has yet not manifested itself in all its fullness. They relate to the darkness and the disillusionment of the disciples that the disciples experienced on the Saturday between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Humanitarian and mission agencies need to understand how to minister in such context. So to conclude, humanitarian agencies do have a place within the mission of God. God in his compassion shows grace and mercy to people who are suffering, and he does it through both Christian and secular agencies. However, Christian humanitarian agencies can have a significantly greater impact if they were to partner with local churches. This requires an understanding of how God is using man-made and natural disasters to build and renew his church and to speak to hard-to-reach people and people groups. Most humanitarian agencies are Western in their orientation and operations, even if they have national branches in the global South. If they choose to minister holistically, they need to understand their own theological, philosophical, and political frameworks from which they operate and realize that much of the rest of the world operates differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupen. And in response to Rupen's plenary talk, we have Dr. Daniel Wong, who will be giving his response from the point of view of the academy. And so, as you probably are aware, and some of you are not, we are doing a live stream of the plenary sessions to various EMS Canada centers. So we are just going to quickly switch the mics because we need to have a live stream also for the responder. But I'd like for you to kindly look at the bio for Daniel. Daniel is an associate professor at the Tyndale University in College, and he is in the Ministry of Christian Ministry, and he will be giving a 7-minute response, right, Daniel? Great. To the talk of Rupen. Let's welcome Dr. Daniel Wong.
I want to thank Dr. Das for starting off our conference with such a thought-provoking presentation. It sets the tone for our day, one of critical thinking and compassion about our theme, Mission Amidst Global Crises. What I appreciated about your presentation was the way you clearly led up to and clearly articulated your main point. Christian humanitarian agencies can have a significant greater impact if they were to partner with local churches. The questions you raised in your paper require additional processing by all of us. Some of the most striking, I thought, were what is the relationship between evangelism and providing humanitarian aid? Is humanitarian assistance or other acts of compassion by themselves valid ministry and part of the mission of God, even if there is no proclamation of and evangelism? And what is the relationship between Christian humanitarian agencies and the local church? My main framework is coming from the branch of pastoral theology called homiletics, or preaching. And I appreciate the way you challenged a Western understanding of preaching the Word of God without proper contextualization, although you did not use that term at this time. I was one of the organizers of our Tyndale Preaching Conference this Tuesday, where I see a number of you are conferenced out this week, or conference junkies, but we were here on Tuesday as well as today. The main topic was understanding the people who hear our sermons. And the main speaker was Dr. Matthew Kim, who wrote about this topic, and that was actually his subtopic, and the main topic of the book was Preaching with Cultural Intelligence. The wedding of word and practice to communicate and incarnate the Christian gospel is what you underscored, and I really appreciate that. We often encourage our students to provide some critique if they're doing a book review, and I had to stretch to find some things in this. And I think it's due to this, the length and scope of the paper and focus of the paper, but just maybe some questions to raise, some things to explore, and I think probably for all of us to explore these areas a bit further. One of those would be, what is the difference and contributions of Christian, of these humanitarian agencies and those who are not? I know you started to explore that, and I think we could continue to explore, and we need to co-work with those that are designated or self-proclaimed Christian and those that are not. And the second thing is maybe we need to continue to probe deeper about Christian humanitarian agencies. And many of you represent that particular sphere this morning. And I just encourage us, and Dr. Doss has done that as well, is to rethink about what's our mission, what's our focus, what's our biblical mandate, theological thinking, and how does that work out in relationship to this area. And thirdly, I think we often use Missio Dei and the mission of God. And I think we also continue to explore what does that really mean, and how does that translate into the various contexts. We are currently in our movement toward the cross and resurrection in the current Christian year, season of Lent. You spoke about a theological framework that appreciates the Saturday between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And it is that now and not yet existence that often is underscored theologically that we find ourselves dwelling and ministering. And I think we are exploring that today, how we are living in that sequence as we move toward the cross, but also understand more about that Saturday, that in-between existence that many, especially in the non-Western world, would appreciate. So thank you again, Dr. Doss, for your plenary talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Wong. Before we go to our table talk, I invited a friend who understands what it is to be in global crisis as a refugee. I have asked my friend Mitala, who came from Burma, and share his story in the process of being a refugee and being here also in Canada. Let's welcome our brother Mitala.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Pastor Neri, for putting me on the spotlight. Although it is not my first time to talk before this wonderful group of people, I don't know, somehow I'm so nervous. So I just think in my mind, what if I pass out with heart attack here? I also trying to do math in my head. If ever this happened, then I have a good number of people who can apply CPR on me. So I have a good chance to survive. Like Pastor Neri said, yes, I was from Burma. I belong to Karen ethnic group, Karen, which is one of the minority ethnic groups in Burma, and also subject to persecution for many, many years. This country was a country that had world's longest civil war, and then also a lot of human rights violation, ethnic cleansings, social unrest going on decade after decade, decade after decade. So being a minority ethnic group living in a predominantly Buddhist country, so people from my generation even couldn't comprehend that why we are being persecuted or being a Karen or why we are being pushed and all this kind of thing. The other scary thing that the government, which is military dictatorship ruling the country since 1962 and practically until now, they use the tool of rape and human rights violation to do ethnic cleansing. So gradually that led many ethnic people to flee their birthplace, run to the neighboring countries and become refugees. And I became refugee in Thailand in 1994 when I was 17 years old, and I was in Thailand as refugee for 13 years. So being a refugee in Thailand, so we were placed in the refugee camps. We have 9 different Karen refugee camps along Thailand-Burma border, which is 6 kilometers away from the border inside Thailand. The smallest camp had 4,000 Karen refugees, and the biggest camp had 46,000 Karen refugees. So the good thing that we were so grateful to Thai government for giving us a place to live in the country as a refugee. Unfortunately, also since Thai government did not sign in the UN Convention of the Refugee Right and Protection, also we were not acknowledged as refugees in Thailand at all. We were acknowledged as temporarily displaced people in Thailand, which means that we have no right to pursue higher education, to get employment, and then also to have freedom to travel freely inside Thailand. So at the beginning, when we first became the refugee, our dream was one day to go home, back to the current state, or back to Burma, and to restart our life from the scratch. However, it did not happen after a year. It did not happen after a decade. It did not happen after 2 or 3 decades. In this time of communication age, also you cannot hide anything anymore. So everyone around the world knew what is going on. So what happened? At the time of 2005 and 2008, a new program was introduced to the refugees. They call it Refugees Resettlement Program, starting with a developed country like US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. They opened their doors to the Karen refugees, and they invited us to come. So in the year between 2005 and 2008, Canadian government brought in 6 Karen refugees to this country, and my family was one of those refugees, came to North America in a large scale. So now we have about 6,000 or to 8,000, because 2,000 Karen were born here in Canada. In Canada, across the country, and then 2 to 3, the most is 400 of the Karen refugees are scattered in every major cities in this country. When we first came to Canada, of course, thinking about the refugees, like living in the camp, surrounded by the river and rainforest, being with nature. Many children were born there, and they grew up there, and their horizon daily was this nature, right? So that living there for decade after decade, and in a matter of 2 to 3 days, and they ended up here in Toronto. So the life was totally upside down. So on top of the trauma that they had in their previous life, they had a new kind of trauma. Very simple thing, that they were so scared to go in the subway. They thought that they would be swallowed by the soil or ground. They cannot stand on the 7th or 8th floor of the building here. They thought that they would be swept away by the wind. So I call it elegance trauma here. So we have cold, that we have to adjust to the culture differences, food, and everything here in North America. And also many Karen refugees came to Canada. We came with almost zero of everything. We had zero money, zero education, zero North American experience, and most of us zero language barrier. The only thing we have was the gospel and God, and they were more than enough for us to strike and survive in these lands. So nowadays I'm working as a settlement worker for Jane Finch Center, as also I'm working as accredited court interpreter for the Ministry of Attorney General for the past decade already, and then throughout the experience, after 10 years of living here, I can see that the way that God has been so faithful and doing in the life of the Korean refugees are so tremendous. Many of the refugees here now, the Korean are working as a landscaper. Many of them are working in the factories, in a lot of different sectors and production sectors, and they are so grateful for everything that they experience that they have had in their life. And then also in Toronto alone, I'm so proud to say that we came here and then we had nothing, but after 10 years, we feel that we are so worth under the grace of God, and then also being treasured and respected. And then also it could be also success story that we have zero rate of crime rates here among the Korean refugees here. We have zero rate of the using drug and involved in gang activities. So after all these things and success and every great thing that we experience in Canada, if people ask me, what are you really grateful for and what are the positive impacts or experience that you have in your life, I can simply say that even simply think about the comfort of sitting on the toilet bowl. As we entertain the call of Mother Nature, we can still daydream, and what a comfort and pleasure. We have a smooth road that you drive your own car, a comfortable home that you can live in. Even you go to the bathtub and you turn the tap on the right and you have hot water, and to the left then you have cool water. We can never take granted of all these things, right? And then also about we have a handsome prime minister, rule of law, and we have all the respect that you have. Nobody will put gun on your head and threaten you and all these kind of things. So we are very, very grateful for everything. So thinking of everything, I can boldly declare that our God is very faithful, and then our God is no bias at all. And he's a very jealous God because he's so jealous, doesn't want to share with me the devil, doesn't want to share with me the persecuted, poverty, or defeat. So in him, we can always be victorious. So while I was the refugee, or while I was the persecuted individual in Burma, or while here I'm in Canada, still our God is still the same and never changed. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for the privilege to talk, and may God bless each and every one of us here.
Thank you very much, Mita. I am so encouraged to hear of Mita's story and what was shared as well. And I was encouraged that the speakers stayed within their time, to the point that we have about 7 minutes before we go to our table talk, which gives us room for a question or two that you would like to ask Dr. Ruben Das or even Dr. Wong or even Mita. If there is a burning question you would like to ask, you have that opportunity in the next few minutes. Okay, Ferdy, and is it for